ThinkTech Asia, and we're talking about the shifting Asian security environment in today's program. We'll be addressing things such as the new amphibious developments with the Japanese Navy, the Philippine situation, maybe something about Thailand's military, Vietnam's delivery of new Russian Kilo-class submarines, and the peacekeeper status of the United States. Where is it, and where is it going to go in the future? And to help us with this discussion, we have a gentleman that you've seen before on our ThinkTech programs, who is, in my mind, a real expert on the security situation in the Asia-Pacific region, and that's Mr. Grant Newsham. Grant, it's nice to have you back on the program here.
Well, thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Grant is formerly an active United States Marine Corps colonel. He was the liaison officer between the United States Marine Corps in Japan with or in between the Marine Corps and the Japanese Self-Defense Forces. And he is also associated with the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies in Tokyo, and interestingly, also formerly a diplomat with the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. So Grant, again, it's wonderful to have you back on the show with us.
Oh, thank you.
You know, if we take a round-robin look at the whole security environment in the Asia region, we've got some sea changes, some big shifts, and they are broken down into a number of different categories. But for our audience, Grant, let's talk a little bit about some of the hardware or software development, enhancements and capability, if you will. And in the introduction to this program, I mentioned the fact that Vietnam has recently taken delivery of its first of 5 supposedly black hole, super silent Kilo-class Russian submarines. But let's go to Japan and focus on that. And that's an area that you have a lot of expertise in. What for our audiences? What's happened with the Japanese military capability in the last few years?
Well, it's improved considerably, and it's gone from really a situation where the 3 services, the Air Force, Navy, and Army, really didn't cooperate, to one where they're starting to cooperate more. They've always had good equipment, but they were not able to integrate it. And they have, in the last few years, have just made tremendous strides. A large part of that is owing to their focus on amphibious capability.
All right, and let's shift now to the ramifications of that enhancement and capability amongst the Japanese or Japanese Navy. What does that mean?
Well, it means they're better able to defend Japan. You had a situation where Japan was effectively unable to defend itself, and particularly the southern islands known as the Nansei Shoto. But also by improving Japanese capabilities, you have then you've made them a more useful ally to the United States forces, who can now operate with the Japanese. I will note that the 2 navies have always been the exception, and that's really what we should have been aiming for. But you have a more equal balance, and this is important in the way that we perceive Japan and the way they perceive us, and it has political ramifications too.
All right, let's take a look. You know, we know there's some disputes and challenges. What do you see are the enhancement and capabilities in recent times with China?
The Chinese are pretty good. You know, they continue to get better. They've obviously have got a huge defense budget. It increases every year, and their technology, their capabilities have certainly improved. One can of course argue how good they really are, but the more important question is how good do they need to be? And you only need to be good enough to do certain things, but one should certainly not underestimate Chinese military capability, but don't overestimate it either.
Are there any other enhancements in military capability in the region of particular note that you think we should talk about a little bit?
Well, you mentioned one of them, which is submarines. And that is aircraft carriers get a lot of attention. But these days, it's what goes on under the water that is actually more of some would argue, more of a challenge. And you see that the Vietnamese they've gotten some very good ones from the Russians now, and that is significant.
And that fact was not all that well received by the Chinese, as I recall.
It shouldn't be. They, of course, they downplay it, but they could not like that. It does tell you something about the fundamental Chinese-Russian relationship, which sometimes seems like they're close partners, but when you're giving submarines to the Vietnamese, there's
Probably
room for doubt.
not.
Maybe not. Yeah.
Okay. Any other enhancements in capability other than the submarine issue in the region that we should talk about here?
Well, I've mentioned it before. It was really the underreported sub-theme of this the defense development and defense improvement in the Asia region is, I would say, the move towards amphibious capability. You see from one end of Asia, from Korea over to India, you see a renewed focus on that and a real effort, a real desire on these countries to develop the amphibious capability. Well,
with this enhancement of military effectiveness and capability, I think it's important for you and I to talk a little bit about that's not occurring in a vacuum. It's occurring in a situation where there are some very, very serious disputes, in territorial disputes in the region that provide the opportunity for mistake or flashpoint or however you want to describe it. And so let's take maybe the first one that comes to mind between China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands, for example. And control room, if you could show us photograph number 1, please. Grant, here we have the famed Senkaku Islands, and what is it about this dispute that makes it such a flashpoint?
Well, the Chinese have said they're theirs. They said they want it. The Japanese don't want to give it up. And you have a situation where China really has developed its military capabilities. Its economic strength has increased to the point where it now sees that it has the opportunity to try and take back these islands. They may not have a timeline to do it, but certainly they've been very clear that they think it's theirs. The Japanese are not inclined to give it back. And that is, by definition, a very delicate situation.
To emphasize the word delicate in your prior sentence, control room, let's put up for our audience photograph number 2, if we could. And this picture, Grant, what are we looking at here?
You've got the Senkaku, one of the Senkaku Islands in the background, and you have 2 Japanese Japanese Coast Guard patrol vessels, along with a Chinese maritime surveillance vessel. And these are not what you call naval vessels. These are the equivalent of Coast Guard. And they're playing a cat and mouse game, sort of like you might have had 3 or 4-year-olds doing on the playground, with one trying to pester the other. And this has been ongoing for a good couple of years now. It's intensified a lot, but that's what you see there.
And photograph number 2A, control room, let's take a look at this one. Here we've got a close-up shot of that Chinese surveillance ship in the foreground, and the Japanese Coast Guard very close by in the background there. And I guess this poses the potential for a real scrape, doesn't it?
You know, it really does. And really all it takes is one shot in the wrong circumstances. And it is, so when people do describe this as a very delicate situation, make no mistake, it is, and it really does just take one shot. You remember a year and a half ago or so, a Chinese ship actually locked its radar onto a Japanese naval vessel. This is irresponsible behavior by any measure. But the Japanese have shown admirable restraint. But it is a troubling situation, obviously. There are people who actually make a living of keeping track of how often and how many Chinese ships come in. And when the number goes up, then they say, well, things are dangerous. When they go down, they think, well, this is an improvement. It's a hard thing to calculate from, but it remains a very serious problem.
You know, Grant, because of your work in Japan and your liaison connections with the Japanese self-defense forces, as we look at the Senkaku Island dispute, does it appear from your perspective that both sides are bullying each other, or is it the China side that's doing the pushing?
It's China that's doing the pushing. They decided that they were going to make an issue of it, and they've been doing that.
Control room, let's take a look at photograph number 3, if we could. And Grant, just so you know, that ship in the foreground is a Chinese surveillance or intelligence ship, and it goes by the name of the Haijian, I think if I'm pronouncing correct, Haijian 27. And I wanted to ask you, why are they using surveillance or intelligence ships around the Senkakus? What's the intelligence to be gathered there?
Well, it's not this. Probably better not to call it an intelligence ship, but it would be think of it as a Coast Guard ship. One of the Coast Guards, they patrol your territory, and if China thinks it's their territory, there's a logic to sending out Coast Guard ships. Plus, when you send out basically very lightly armed Coast Guard vessels, it's qualitatively different than sending out what are called gray hulls, a regular Navy ship. So there is a sense here that even on the Chinese side that they don't want to do too much at this point. And so when you see these white ships, that it's a degree less or lower than if you saw naval ships out there.
It's the white versus the gray.
If you see the gray ones, then you will know something has changed.
All right. For those of you in the audience that maybe have a hard time visualizing where this is, I know many of you do know. Control room, let's put up photograph number 4 if we could. And Grant, what's helpful for the audience to know about this particular map?
To orient yourself, you can see Taiwan down there in the bottom left. And most people know where Taiwan is. And you can see China off to the left, off to the west, not that far. But then below it, you see some small dots. And those are the far end of the Ryukyu chain. So that is actually Japanese territory. But it's a lot of people talk about the Senkaku Island, and they don't. It's hard to imagine where it is because it's not quite in the middle of nowhere, but it's getting there, and it's worth to. You can see how close it is and why it is disputed.
You know, Grant, there are a number of other flashpoints from a security standpoint in the Asia-Pacific region. I mean, we have the situation involving North and South Korea with the DMZ, certainly flashpoints involving fishermen or exchanges of naval gunfire between Vietnam and China. But let's take a look next at another flashpoint, and that is involving the Philippines. And Control Room, if you put up map number 5 for our audience here. And Grant, let's talk about the Second Thomas Shoal, and what's the significance of this particular location and that's shown on the map here?
Well, it's down in the South China Sea, and if you look at the map, it's very close to China, to the Philippines, near Palawan Islands, very close. And then you look way up to the northwest, to the left, and you see China. And what it is it illustrates the degree to which China is claiming territories that have historically belonged to other people, quite a ways from Chinese territory. And the Filipinos lost a similar shoal, a reef, about a year and a half ago called Scarborough Shoals. Now,
what do you mean they lost it?
The Chinese basically pushed the Philippines off
Scarborough Reef.
That's right, and they kept Philippine vessels from getting in, both fishing vessels and a Philippine Navy ship, blocked them off, and have since put a boom over the entrance to the reef. And they now have a permanent presence at Scarborough Shoals. That happened with almost no mention by the United States. The Filipinos were not in a position to do anything. That happened, and now the next thing, you move along to Second Thomas Shoal, and something similar is ongoing now. How it will end is not uncertain.
We'll come back after the break, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll talk more about some of these ongoing disputes and what's happening in terms of the shifting security environment in the Asia-Pacific region when we come back. Stay with us.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Yamashita, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And Urban Transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Thank you.
We're back. You are watching ThinkTech's Asia, and I'm your host, David Day. Our special guest for this program on the shifting Asia security environment is Mr. Grant Newsham, a former diplomat with the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and currently with the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies in Tokyo. Right before the break, we were talking about some of the security challenges that the Philippines is facing, and we were talking about this Second Thomas Shoal situation, Grant, and I want to show our audience what the Philippine presence is on Second Thomas Shoal, because I think it's important. And so, control room, if you would put up for us photograph number 6, and then followed by photograph number 8 there. And Grant, what are we looking at here?
In order to stake their claim to Second Thomas Shoal, the Filipinos rammed an old U.S. ship that they were given onto the reef. And
this is the Sierra Madre.
That's right, and they've sort of tied it down.
Okay.
And they've got it's probably less than a platoon of Philippine Marines who live on it, and it's been described as something out of Mad Max. So this looks actually pretty good. It's like a tropical resort in the Bahamas, perhaps, but it's
for their ship.
Yeah, it's tough living, but that is what they have done to try and stake a claim to this. And recently the Chinese have attempted to block off the ship and interfere with resupply efforts, and it really is very much an open question how this will end up.
Well, I don't know whether it's the Scarborough Shoal incident or the Second Thomas Shoal incident involving China and the Philippines that is the the cause, maybe you can help me with this, but the Philippines has taken China to the International Court of Justice in an arbitration, a territorial dispute over these islands. In other words, the Philippines is trying to invoke the rule of international law. China is not participating. Do you know which one of these particular shoals is involved in that particular court claim?
I don't know which one, but the case came after the Scarborough Shoals incident. Obviously, the one reason for bringing the case is because civilized nations solve disputes through courts. Another one is the Filipinos simply had no other means to defend themselves.
Let's go back, Grant, for a moment to this map that we were looking at, control room. That would be number 5, if we could go back to that map here. And one of the things that I wanted to point out to the audience that is to kind of emphasize the point you made, Grant, is look how far from the Chinese mainland this second Thomas Shoal is. And this is not the southernmost point of the Chinese territorial claim in the South China Sea, is it?
No, it's not. It's not even close, actually.
Yeah, that claim, the so-called 9-dash line, runs way on down beyond into Malaysian territory there off of Borneo.
That's right. And then it keeps going off to the west, and it grabs a couple of, at least one Indonesian island much farther to the west. So it sort of scoops out the entire South China Sea.
Scoops out. I like
sort of
interesting.
doing it like
Scoops
that.
out. Let's take one other look at a photograph here, and that's number 7, if we could, control room. Grant, this is a PLA Navy ship, and what's the significance of this, really?
Putting it simply, the PLA and the Navy in particular is pretty good. They have good hardware. They've got long-range anti-ship missiles. Are they perfect, or are they at the U.S. Navy level? Probably not, but they don't have to be. But it does point out over the last 30 years, the tremendous strides the Chinese military has made, and this is believe me, this is they've gotten the technology pretty good, and they're have really moved up in terms of capability.
This is, in fact, the view the visual concern that many of the smaller countries in Southeast Asia have about facing off with the PLA Navy, isn't it? This is what the opposing side's firepower might look like if they get into a scrape.
Well, that's what it would. And certainly one might argue that had the PRC continued their charm offensive, which, if you can remember back 7-8 years,
this is the peaceful rise concept.
That's right, and they were doing a very good job with their diplomats and ambassadors throughout the region, almost throughout the world, putting on a very friendly face. That had they continued that for another 5 years, they probably would have got most of Asia to disarm. And even on the U.S. side, there would have probably been, we would have convinced ourselves that there was really nothing to fear from China. But they, for whatever reason, could not restrain themselves and ended the charm offensive, and are showing something very different, which as a result has caused many Asian nations to beef up their own militaries, but also get closer to the United States.
Well, let's talk about that in a moment. But the waning charm offensive, as you've put it, is really if we focus in on that and we really drill down on the big picture of Chinese foreign policy in recent years, don't we have really a schizophrenic type of situation where we've got on one hand we've got a bully type approach, and on the other it's the fluffy panda. And somewhere, and China actually vacillates between the bully and the fluffy panda. And then there are ramifications to that because they're losing enormous credibility with the neighboring countries. Effectively, that's what you're saying, right?
It certainly is. That's what's happened.
So let's go now into the product that you alluded to of that, and that's a shift in the relationship or alliances or perspectives among these nations. And let's take the first one. What's happened, because this is the country that you have the most expertise in, is Japan. What's happened as a consequence of this Senkaku Islands dispute and the way China has conducted or is conducting itself in terms of the Japanese relationship with the U.S.? What's happened?
What you see is the Japanese government, is better to say, and I think it does extend down to the population at large, certainly has come to appreciate the United States more than they did.
Didn't they appreciate us before?
I think they took us for granted too often. There was, of course, it's not to say they did not have any appreciation, but generally we were taken for granted. The presence of U.S. forces in Japan was actually seen as something with little relationship to Japan's interests, and having some vague connection to the Korean Peninsula, or allowing the Americans to go to war in other places. But it was interesting, say, just how little the average Japanese, but particularly the average Japanese politician and government official had, how little sense of the immediate benefit Japan got from U.S. forces. If you just go back 5-6 years.
And this is interesting that you share this perspective as a former diplomat with the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and as the lone liaison officer between the United States Marine Corps and the Japanese Self-Defense Forces.
It only took one.
It only took one.
Yeah, it's the Marines.
Okay, all right. So let's talk about the U.S. presence in the region. I mean, how has it been affected in terms of the Philippines?
Well, you will remember it was about 1992-ish. The Philippines asked the United States forces to leave. Well, they didn't ask us, they told us to leave.
Yeah.
And so we left. And then as time passes and
so this is the loss of Subic Bay and what was the Air Force Base?
Clark
Field.
And QB Point Naval Air Station. But then time passes and
things change.
Things change. And it's in this last few years that you have seen suddenly the fear of China has caused the Philippines to see things differently and really welcome us back. And also particular interest, they've even recently, the government officials have made statements welcoming the Japanese military to come to the Philippines to train.
Welcoming the Japanese military into the Philippines to train. Is that what you said?
Yes, that may not happen tomorrow, but it was, they've, it was an interesting
that's
development.
That's a remarkable change, isn't it?
It is, and it's certainly a manifestation of the outcome of ending this charm offensive on the part of the PRC. I think you can make a direct connection to that. And as I said, additionally, the other parts of Asia have, I think, have come to appreciate the U.S. presence more. And our presence is, of course, a voluntary presence, and it's because we're wanted there. Not that we've foisted ourselves on anyone.
What about shifts in the relationship between South Korea and the United States as a consequence? How do you see that?
Well, I think you can learn a lot by considering that there's been a plan to change what is called OPCON, operational control of the combined Korean-U.S. forces to defend the peninsula. At least 3 times the South Koreans have asked us not to give them the OPCON. You guys keep it for a little while longer.
All right, so for the audience, let's help that. So the plan was that the United States forces would move to the rear and that the South Korean forces would step to the front and take over operational command in the country, so that something like that?
Yeah, that's not too far off. It's not so much a physical move back to the rear, but you have your command and control center, for example.
Okay.
And it had always been an American who was in charge of all the forces, dictating, telling where they would go. He was the guy in charge, and the idea was, well, this is South Korea. They should be in charge. And the South Koreans have repeatedly said, well, could you not do it so fast and you guys stay in charge for a while? And it gets across, though, just how, I'd say, welcome this U.S. presence is for all the sort of the breastbeating we sometimes do about how we're not liked, that we're certainly still welcome in South Korea and our presence appreciated.
Well, I think, one of the situations that we haven't talked much about in the show so far is the whole challenge that the South Koreans and the U.S. forces face vis-a-vis North Korea with the new leader Kim Jong-un. And I suppose if you go back into the past, you know, the events or challenges that North Korea would pose typically were relatively predictable. Mm-hmm. That is, there were certain security exercises that the United States and the Republic of South Korea were going to engage in, and right before that they would engage, there would always be this hellfire and brimstone, you know, we're going to devastate you, that kind of thing, right before those exercises. And now with Kim Jong-un, you know, we see a lot of internal political developments that seem to be more unpredictable than in the past. And that raises the specter that perhaps an event could occur that the U.S. or South Korean forces are not anticipating, and the potential for a miscalculation, misfire, or an engagement. I mean, do you see that as one of the dangers with this new leader?
I do, actually. There is a tendency to just say, well, North Korea is nuts and it will always be nuts, and you know, nothing will change. But one looks at the new leader and considers how the U.S. analysts, the experts, all predicted things, and they've all been wrong. There's this idea, well, he grew up in Switzerland, so
right.
he has a different take on
attitude,
things.
yeah.
His uncle's going to run things and keep him under control. And well, his uncle was, you know, either destroyed by a mortar bomb or eaten by dogs and monkeys. His uncle was executed. But everything they've predicted has been wrong about him, and he seems to play by even a different set of rules by North Korean standards. And you throw, once again, improving nuclear weapons and capability and improving missile capability, and but to a degree, it is a different, more, I think, dangerous situation than you've had previously.
You know, one of the areas that we haven't discussed that I want to ask you about is Taiwan. And in terms of the enhancement of military capability, there is either a sale of F-16s or an upgrade of F-16 hardware, either in progress or being talked about. I don't know where that is precisely. But what is the situation militarily that Taiwan now faces?
Well, they've obviously been facing just militarily a much Chinese defense capability, which has just been outstripping whatever Taiwan can put up. And it does require a more asymmetric approach to defending Taiwan, making it a tough nut to crack. And this does require transformation of both Taiwan military organization and also from a hardware perspective. But it is not a particularly expensive thing. Its asymmetric capabilities are generally pretty cheap.
What does asymmetric mean in this context?
It means relative, I would say, anti-ship missiles, sea mines, a very mobile emergency counterattack force you could use the Taiwan Marines for. A focus on operations in combat operations in urban terrain. Just a complete rethink of how the Taiwan Marines are used would be an appropriate thing. But you're trying to make yourself a tough nut to crack, sort of in the way Switzerland is.
So what you're saying is that Taiwan is not in a position now, nor will it be, to defeat China. It's just trying to get itself in a position to be a punishing enough adversary that China won't mess with them.
That's right, and that's about as much as they could hope for. I also didn't mention submarines. The Taiwanese have wanted to get them from the United States for many years, unsuccessfully. They've tried; no one else will sell them to them. So they've recently announced that they're going to build their own. And once again, it points out the importance of that undersea capability.
And Taiwan has had an extraordinary run of fabulous capability in terms of building, shipbuilding as well as yacht building. So there's no question in your mind that they can build their own submarines if they choose to.
I would be inclined to bet on it. And as long as we're on Taiwan, I would note that it really is it is a priceless country, a priceless place. As
Meaning what? Meaning, what do you mean?
What I mean by that is that as I've been hearing, the first time I heard it was 1980 from some visitors from the PRC to UCLA, and they claimed that that the Chinese people could not handle democracy, that therefore the Chinese government needed to be repressive, just to keep order. That was what they claimed, just for a little while longer. Well, 35 years later, nothing much has changed. But what I mean is Taiwan is a priceless example that Han Chinese can rule themselves with consensual government. They can handle freedom of the press, freedom of expression. It provides actually a wonderful example to mainland China of what the future could be.
For mainland China.
That's right, yeah. It's
Interesting. Well, you know what, let's do. Let's go to a break, and when we come back from the break, let's talk about the U.S. policy in dealing with China and what you see have been the mistakes and where you think U.S. policies should be to be more successful.
Right.
We'll do that when we come back from the break. Ladies and gentlemen, you are watching ThinkTech Asia.
Hi, my name is Dr. Rafi. Every week, I'm right here at ThinkTech Hawaii, 3 p.m. on Mondays. My show is Boards' Bio Briefings. What do we do here? Well, we watch sperm swim, we see if they catch anybody, we check out the latest biosimilars, you know, the kind that, what was his name, the guy with the bicycle? I guess we forgot his name, but he was taking EPO and other human growth factors. We'll be talking about human growth factors. You want to know where to get some? Maybe I'll tell. Anyway, you can catch me, as I said, every week right here, Monday, 3 p.m., ThinkTech Hawaii, Dr. Rafi. You can also find me on Twitter, BioInfoMedical. Or you can catch me on Facebook, Dr. Rafael Boritzer. I'll be happy to converse with you. Aloha.
We're back. You're watching or listening to The Shifting Asian Security Environment with Mr. Grant Newsham as our special guest. And Grant, what are we looking at here?
What you're seeing is Chinese Navy ships on maneuvers. You can see what they're doing, which is what navies do. But this is particularly interesting here. It's a simulation, actually, of missiles hitting an aircraft carrier.
Okay.
And the only country that has it, well, the country they're talking about here is the United States. We're the ones with aircraft carriers. This is it's not anything new, really. The Chinese have been talking about defeating a country with aircraft carriers since the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989.
Let's go now from this situation of attacking aircraft carriers to the broad discussion of U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis China. Mm-hmm. And bottom line, if you take let's take a 20, 30 year sweep looking backwards, Grant, how would you characterize it?
Well, it's been an effort to accommodate China so that it gradually turns into really something like a liberal democracy that follows law, that has both domestically and internationally, shows respect for its neighbors, and is not a threat to anyone. The idea was to have it gradually emerge into a responsible stakeholder in the sort of the international community.
Okay. And so that means back off on interfering with any of these territorial disputes, doesn't it?
That was part of it, was to be very studious about not taking a position, not really requiring the PRC to really live up to sort of international standards. The World Trade Organization is an excellent example.
What do you mean by that?
There's all sorts of, what you call them, exceptions that the PRC got when they were allowed into the World Trade Organization. That they didn't have to follow rules which everyone else did. And the idea was gradually they would come about.
They would shape up just over the course of time.
The idea was it would just happen naturally. It really hasn't yet.
Okay, so let's go back to your experience, your perspective moving forward. How should the United States conduct its foreign policy vis-a-vis China?
Well,
from your perspective.
Yeah, this is just my perspective, and if you follow the debate in Washington, there's probably 10,000 people who have a perspective. So I would be one of them. But you want to say this excessively accommodating approach hasn't really produced anything over 30, 35 years. You could do these, one basic structure might be to start making it very clear that we have our own core interests. One often hears the Chinese declare things their core interests, the idea is nobody can touch them. Well, we have our own, we should make that clear, and you do have to stand up for yourself. This US-Japan relationship, particularly the defense relationship, that becomes more equal and more interoperable, that is something which is a very useful sort of thing to have. That needs to be improved and stretched, it needs to be improved. Taiwan, once again, as I mentioned, is a priceless example of what China could be. We would do well to fully live up to the terms of the Taiwan Relations Act and to ensure that Taiwan, it does have the means to defend itself, and also to encourage it, that it does have the support, because it does feel dwarfed by a giant neighbor sometime. As I'd mentioned, the World Trade Organization, we would do well to require China to follow the rules. It's been 30 years, Japan, or 20, roughly 20 since they got into WTO, and the Chinese economy is perhaps bigger than ours. It's time for them to play by the rules, require them to obey these rules. Additionally, support the countries like the Philippines when they bring cases against China that we agree with. And finally, the one that would be very useful, I think, is there's been a huge sort of outflow, illegal outflow of money from China.
Okay. So this is the kind of the situation we saw with what was it, the Bloomberg report that reported on the family holdings of the former premier.
That's right, and New York Times did as well. So you have this that's part of this huge outflow of money from China. And
this is the corruption theft situation.
That's all it is.
Okay.
It's illegal outflow. Not, it's the illegal stuff. Well, I think this would be very helpful for us to help the Chinese find this money.
And that could be done easily.
I think it wouldn't be too hard, and we would certainly do well to. I think the Chinese would probably appreciate it if we were to uncover this, no matter whose it is, and just tell them where it is, and also publicize where it is. But it is the corruption which really does hinder China's advance, and we would perhaps be doing them a favor by finding that money and making clear people know where it is.
You know, in what you have just said, if we in addition to the finding the corruption, the treasure chest, if you will, another way of saying what you've just described with reversing this kind of this rollover, wishy-washy accommodation policy that the United States has had vis-a-vis China over the last several years is to understand the difference between red lines and pink lines. And I've heard it said that some time ago in other parts of the world, the United States had very clear red lines that you will not cross this red line, and if you do, there will be consequences. And it seems like with the current administration and in more recent times, going back, into other administrations, that this red line has kind of been diluted out to pink lines. And so because the lines are kind of nebulous, that it makes it difficult to maintain security and order in a global context. Do you buy that, or is that a theory that's way off?
Oh, I think there's something to it. In fact, I would tend to agree with it. There's ultimately, you have to be taken seriously. And if you can be taken seriously without using words red lines, people know when you're serious and they know when you're not.
All right, well, let's talk about being taken seriously, because as we are doing this show today, we are doing it in with the backdrop of an imploding Ukraine, a situation in Syria that has been an embarrassment to the United States, nuclear containment discussions with Iran that haven't gone anywhere, what looks like a waste of time in negotiations between Israel and Palestine. The whole Libya Benghazi situation, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And so now we come to the events of this past several days, President Obama's trip to Asia. And where do you see President Obama's comments, discussions in this recent trip fitting into this whole picture?
I think the president, I thought he did very well. He went to Japan, and I think he surprised a lot of people by how forthright he was in declaring that the United States will defend Japan. That was I think, a big surprise for some Japanese. But
why would that be a surprise? Because of the Article 5 defense obligations that the United States has undertaken vis-a-vis Japan. Why would that be a surprise? Because they didn't believe the U.S. would ever do that?
There was plenty of skepticism, and you know, we're lawyers, so you can read Article 5, and there's all sorts of ways to get out of defending Japan if you don't want to. But by coming to Japan, and speaking clearly, President Obama had a huge effect on both the Japanese and I would submit on the Chinese government as well.
Okay, and then he also made a trip to Manila. Mm-hmm. And what about his comments made in the Philippines?
Once again, I think he did a good job. He spoke clearly enough, and I think left an impression that the United States just might defend the Philippines.
Just might defend.
Using that a little loosely, but probably, you know, there's another. What it does is it raises.
A definite maybe.
Maybe at least that, but it definitely raises the possibility in Chinese, from a Chinese perspective, that maybe the Americans will get involved, because I think there was some considerable doubt that we would. So the president actually did a very good job on his trip out here. Of course, the pundits can, you know, you can dissect it and find fault here and there, but I think it surprised a lot of people with how well they did. The important thing, of course, is whether or not we maintain that position. There is a tendency as time passes, and often not very much time, to kind of forget about the need to really show some backbone, but it needs to be continued for a good long while.
Well, like the Article 5 defense situation that the United States has with Japan, the U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, does it not?
That's right.
And the Taiwan Relations Act provides for a U.S. defense of Taiwan, does it not? Mm-hmm. And so what you're saying is the recent trip by President Obama to Asia has a bolstering effect, at least temporarily.
That's right.
And so what would you, if the administration is serious, what would you expect to see as the follow-on to President Obama's comments? What would you expect?
Well, one you would expect to see, of course, an adequate U.S. defense budget, so that we can actually, you know, have adequate forces worldwide, but also in Asia, of course. Diplomatically, you need to continue this kind of clear talk, not just the president, but he's the most important, but across the administration, across the U.S. government, make it very clear that we have interests, core interests that we will protect. We have allies that we will protect them. When you have incidents, and putting it in very simple terms, there's been some near collisions between U.S. Navy ships and Chinese ships. You'd better be willing to bump back on occasion. But you have to be taken seriously. A treaty is one thing, red lines are another thing, but people know when you're serious. I'd also mention things like the Taiwan Relations Act, making sure that we are living up to those terms. From a trade perspective as well, just requiring the Chinese to follow the rules everyone else does. So it isn't simply a military or even a diplomatic approach, but it's a combination of these things.
Excellent. Well, Grant, we're out of time, and again, on behalf of ThinkTech, I want to thank you for coming and joining us for the show. It's always such a joy to have you, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm David Day. You've been watching the shifting Asian security environment here on ThinkTech. Please have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you next week. Same time, same place.